Good morning, and thank you for being here. My name is Moises Naim. I'm the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and I'll be the moderator this morning. There are hardly any subjects these days that are more controversial, confusing, and present than globalization. You can almost use that for advancing or detracting from any argument of the world today. We have a wonderful group of people that will help us clarify our thinking about globalization and also identify ways to think forward about it. Starting at my right and your left is Joe Stiglitz, well known. He's a professor at Columbia University, a Nobel Prize winner, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of President Clinton, and former chief economist at the World Bank. Then we have next to him Taizo Nishimuro, chairman of the board of Toshiba Corporation. Peter Sutherland, the founding director general of the World Trade Organization, now with Goldman Sachs, also a member of the World Economic Forum board. Vijay Mahatan from India, he's a social entrepreneur and runs a company in microfinance that actually is bridging the world of capital markets and the world of social development. Juan Somavia, the Director or Secretary General of the International Labour Organization, who is not only well known for having transformed that organization, but is a well-respected thinker on his own right. And then we have you all to pose questions and give us comments. What we'll do is we'll start with a round of questions, and then we will open up to your comments and reactions. I will start with Juan Somavia. The International Labour Organization put together a very high-level group to discuss, it's a commission on the social dimension of globalization. As we all know, there is much talk about the economics of globalization, but also there is a lot of concerns, apprehension, and outright criticisms of the social consequences of globalization. Taking that into account, Juan organized and convened this high-level commission that is going to issue a report soon. The report is not yet completed, but Juan has been steering and being present at the conversation, so we're going to ask about his own personal opinions and insights and surprises. What are the main surprises of the work on the Commission on the social dimensions of globalization?
I think that there is possibility to find common ground when, if you look at the papers and you look at the meetings and you look elsewhere, you have a feeling that we will never find a way to steer globalization in a manner that everybody will feel is reasonable. I think that what we are seeing today is a pretty large consensus that we need a more fair and more inclusive process of globalization. And how to get there, the point of departure, I think, is that you have to ask people, well, how they have perceived this. And there are many, many different perceptions, but there is one that is overriding globally, and that is people feel that their life at work has been affected, that unemployment is extremely high, and that the possibilities for decent work are not big. So the main demand coming from people is that, which is, every politician knows, expresses itself in any election. No politician can go to any election today without offering something in the field of jobs. So I think that the main responsibility we have is to be able to orient the future rules of globalization, make them fairer, but to concentrate on job creation. Today you have 1 billion people that are either unemployed, underemployed, or working poor. And that, I think, is the key central political issue, but it's also the key central economic issue. Because we have very low levels of growth, because we have very low levels of real demand.
Is there a specific concrete proposal, do you think, an actionable proposal that you have in your mind that should be floated?
Well, you see, you don't solve the employment issue with one proposal. So the approach is precisely, there are things that you need to do at home. We put very little emphasis on local, very lot on global, very little on local.
But if you had to pick your personal favorite, if you were given the choice of making one proposal that will be widely adopted by governments everywhere, what would you suggest? One that we know will be not sufficient, and it's a big problem that needs a multifaceted set of policy responses. But if you had to pick your own personal favorite, which
I would say make the goal of decent work a global goal, get the finance ministers of the group of 20, to deal with the macroeconomics of it, get the international organizations to get their act together. They're totally underperforming. We should get the Monetary Fund, the World Bank, UNDP, WTO, ILO, and others to integrate economic and social policies. If you don't do that, you can't get it. And it's very important that we're having this discussion in the context of Davos. You need the Davos constituency to be part of a public-private partnership that can make this happen. So you have the actors, you have the potential, we have the instruments. We just need to agree politically, together all, that if we don't solve the employment and decent work deficit that is in the world, this is probably the biggest security danger that we have in front of us.
Thank you, Juan. That's very interesting. Peter, you have been at the center of many of these debates. You are the founding father in many ways, one of the founding fathers of the WTO. For many people, globalization is just shorthand for free trade. Was it free trade in the 90s pursued too quickly? What is your view of where are we with trade? And there is a general, it seems there is a general apprehension these days against trade.
Well, the difficulty of the complexity of globalization and debating it is that the arguments are often hijacked by the sound bites of ayatollahs on either extreme. And of course, it's an extremely complicated, and it is not a symmetrical progression in terms of the liberalization of trade. Trade negotiations, take the Uruguay round, which created the WTO, 22,000 pages of text between undertakings of individual countries. And of course, there are many aspects of any negotiation of that complexity that you can complain about. Didn't move fast enough on something, or moved a little too fast on something else. And you're never going to get perfection. And post facto analysis is very easy, especially for the critics who sit on the sidelines and didn't participate in it. But the overwhelming reality of the integration of markets and the opening of markets is the increase of opportunity. And the overwhelming, I think, reality of the post-liberalization world that we're moving into, in the sense of opening of markets to the extent that we have done it, is positive. There are parts of the world, however, who have not participated in this. It's not that globalization has significantly negatively affected them, although there are parts of the processes of, for an example, export subsidies in agricultural products from the European Union, which have negatively affected Africa, for an example. But in the main, you can say that the evidence seems to suggest that the poorer parts of the world, as a result of the opening of borders, are being given a greater opportunity to develop than they would have had we remained in a world of divided markets or regional markets. And therefore, from that point of view, the overall result, I think, has been positive.
One of the things that globalization, one of the consequences, is that it has increased the expansion, the rapid expansion of trade, investment, the movement of people, ideas, and so on, have increased very much the need for institutions of global governance. It has the demand for the effective coordination between governments has increased. But at the same time that the demand has increased, we have seen that the capacity of these organizations of global governance is either stagnant or decreasing. And one of the big examples of that, of course, is trade. While global trade is growing, the institutions of global trade are mired in gridlock, and the meeting after meeting, seems to be very frustrating in terms of outcomes. What do you see forward in terms of this growing demand for effective global governance and what we see as stagnant? Juan Somavia just said that all of the institutions, he mentioned the IMF, the World Bank, and WTO, he called them underperforming, is the word he used. So what's your outlook on this?
Well, I don't agree with them for a start off that they're underperforming in the sense that the WTO, at least, I think, is an amazing success. It has created, for an example, a dispute settlement body, which is for the first time ever we have the opportunity of playing to some extent on a rule-based economic system where, for an example, the weak can complain and have an adjudication of their disputes against the powerful. If you don't have a rule-based system, you have the law of the jungle, and ultimately the most powerful will demonstrate that through taking unilateral steps which will be deeply dangerous. It's not a coincidence that the defendants in the vast bulk of cases before the WTO are either the European Union or the United States, and in many cases those cases have been brought by people who otherwise would have had no recourse. If you're referring to the failure of Cancun, I do not think that is, I think it was unfortunate. I think it might well have turned out differently, but it's part of a process which we've seen many times before, and I think ultimately, and the signals indeed in Davos this week, are that there will be movement forward in that process of negotiation, which hopefully will bring further positive developments. So overall, I think that the WTO, at least, has done reasonably well. And I would merely make this point about the other institutions. The difficulty about institutions, and the Commission on Human Security report makes this clear, you can't ultimately solve the problems that need to be solved simply by a process of trade liberalization or by recourse to the very limited resources available to the World Bank or to the protection mechanisms, whether properly or improperly applied in particular cases of the IMF and cases of emergency. The bottom line is that all the rhetoric about fairness is not being matched, for an example, by the commitment to pay 0.7 of 1% of GDP to the developing countries. It's simply not coming. And in the end of the day, international organizations can't make up for the inadequacy of response of national government, where around the world they don't seem to be willing or able, and perhaps their democracies don't allow them, to provide the degree of real support that is needed to allow people to participate in globalization. And just finally to conclude on this by saying that if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, simply opening up the opportunities for trade, although that may be important, and indeed of the least developing economies, the growth in manufactured exports has been very significant in many of them. But at the end of the day, the problems relate to infrastructure, including human infrastructure. And these can't simply be solved by trade or opening up borders. It involves a lot more than that, but it's part of the answer.
Juan wanted quickly to...
Just one point on the underperformance. Now, our function here is not to be passing judgment on each international organization. What I said is that we are underperforming in terms of cooperation. And you cannot deal with global issues sectorially. You've just confirmed that.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, and what I said is that we need to work together between all these organizations to integrate economic and social policies. We're not doing it today. To the extent that we're not doing it, we're underperforming.
An important question there is, well, if that's so obvious and it has been said and it's so natural, why is it not happening? I will get back to you on that. On
sure.
Why such an obvious, important, urgent need is so difficult to make it happen. Joe Stiglitz, you have become the most visible, respected critic of globalization. Your books are now read all over the world, has been translated. Your book on the globalization and its discontents is, I think, now translated in more than 30 languages or something. And you have been very specific in your criticisms of globalization, especially the form it took in the 1990s. And you identify mistakes. If you assume that you're right, and how would you go about correcting some mistakes? How do you compensate or correct the mistakes of the 90s?
That's a good and hard question. I think there are two things I'd focus on. One is you have to deal with the legacy of the past, and the second one is you have to learn from those mistakes going forward. Let me give you an example of the legacy of the past, some of the privatizations in Russia that have led to enormous concentration of wealth, giving away the country's assets to a few people in oligarchy. Well, I think one has to deal with that both in terms of economic and politically. You have to make sure that that economic concentration doesn't get reflected in a political concentration that would really undermine democracy and the rule of law, because it's the middle class that historically has been most associated with the support of democratic processes, and that was what was devastated in the manner in which the privatization occurred in Russia. But there are some specific issues that you can deal with. For instance, you could have an excess profits tax, an excess capital gains tax. You can enforce tax laws. You can make sure you have strong competition laws. You can make sure you enforce, if people borrowed money, that they actually repay the money. So there are a whole set of things that you can at least alleviate some of the leveraging of the mistakes. On the other side, in terms of learning the mistakes of the past, some of the things are reversible. Let me give you an example. I think there is now almost universal agreement that the attempt to promote capital market liberalization, the change of the charter that the IMF wanted in '97, was a mistake. Even the IMF has come out with a paper where it points out that it doesn't promote economic growth in some of the countries and does promote instability. Well, there are a variety of ways of intervening in the capital markets to stabilize it. So you can actually change your mindset about this issue. You can encourage countries. And what's so disturbing to me is that the U.S. now is trying to use trade agreements to, just as the IMF is abandoning capital market liberalization, the U.S. insisted in that in its Chile bilateral, insisted in its Singapore trade treaty, and actually put it on the agenda. Fortunately, it was forced off as one of the Singapore issues in the so-called development round. I think the other lesson, one of the things that was learned in the 90s was that the Uruguay round really was unbalanced in many ways. The rhetoric at Doha was very much, we want to redress these imbalances. We want to have a development round. My view of, as I look at what was on the table with the proposals, the United States and Europe reneged from those commitments. And one of the lessons is that you can't do that again. And I really agree with Peter that the rule of law is far more important, was a critical step forward. The U.S. Issues on, the U.S. Steel tariffs, it would have gotten away with it had it not been for the WTO. But now the United States is complaining about Brazil bringing the cotton dispute. And I think the WTO provides a framework in which this is going to be done. But going forward, we have to go beyond just the agricultural issues. There's a whole long list of things that need to be done to make this a development round.
And you were not only critical of globalization, you have also been critical of the U.S. government in a variety of ways. Both you have been critical of administration where you served, and now you are also critical of the Bush administration. And especially you had some very pointed remarks about the role of the United States in the environmental arena.
Yeah, again, I would echo something that Peter said, which is that a lot of the problems can't, at an international level, have to be traced back to the national level. And I'd second the point that there needs to be more assistance. But there's some hidden things. Let me give you one example. There's a broad international consensus about global warming, about the dangers of greenhouse, problems of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's a very big environmental issue. Not allowing the United States to continue to pollute through greenhouse gases is in effect allowing it to subsidize its production at the expense of the rest of the world. That's an issue that needs, I think, to be taken headlong into the WTO. It's not just a question of environmental standards for a particular country. It's really a subsidy to the United States at the expense of the rest of the world.
Do you agree with that, Peter? Do you think the United States has this hidden subsidy that is making it even more competitive at the expense of the rest of the world, and that the way to deal with this is to dump it on the WTO?
Well, I would simply say this, and it's not to evade the question, there are no saints in trade policy. That applies to the United States, it applies to the European Union, and indeed it applies to some developing countries who are damaging their own prospects and their own consumers by retaining very high tariffs in areas where it adds cost to individuals. Of course, the US has a particular issue in a number of areas. The pace of reform, both in the US and in Europe, in agriculture is one example. The whole delay and the whole opening up of markets to textiles is another, something that developing countries need and aspire to. But I'd like to take up one point that was made by Joe, which I think is very important to make, because the real world of trade negotiation unfortunately means that even the description, the development round, gives an impression of a one-way negotiation. And a one-way negotiation, whatever about moral imperatives, won't happen. If there isn't a balance, and this is where the problems arise, because Joe may well say the balance is going to be tilted too much one way rather than another. I totally disagree with him if he is saying that the outcome of the Uruguay round in overall has been disadvantageous. The evidence is absolutely clear that there has been a significant increase, perhaps not as much as there should have been, in, for an example, exports and imports by developing countries and foreign direct investment into developing countries. And many developing countries have used the Uruguay round as a mechanism to prise open their own markets to an extent and involve themselves in a liberalization process which they wanted. China is an example of that. They wanted to use it in their negotiations in their own way for developing their own market-related responses.
Well, we have with us Vijay, who comes from India, and he is perfectly positioned to observe and track some of the consequences of India's opening and the consequences of globalization in the ground, with farmers, and with the low-income clients of his company to whom he gives microcredits. Give us a sense of the very specific, not this very macro view at high altitude, but the very concrete, granular view on the ground with small farmers and microcredits.
Thank you, Moses. You know, the Washington Consensus took only 2 years to reach India. We adopted a very broad swath of liberalization policies starting 1991. And while it's not progressed equally along all the original 10 points which are there in the Washington Consensus, I would say that there has been a very, very dramatic change in the institutional framework of India since 1991 to now. And I personally think it has been more than what happened at independence in 1947. The level of change is that much. However, we must remember that India is a federal polity, and there are 27 states and a number of union territories. And a lot of the microeconomy of consumers and producers actually happens under the realm of the states. And while India as a nation may have, for example, opened up to a whole lot of international trade as well as foreign direct investment, and indeed privatization is beginning to happen in a number of sectors. In practice, a small farmer or a small micro-entrepreneur continues to face a lot of the leftovers of the old, what we in India call the Inspector Raj or the License Raj, you know, where virtually for everything you need permissions and licenses, and there's over-regulation, the kind that Hernando de Soto so graphically pointed out in his empirical research. Just to give you one example, in southern India, groundnut, peanut is a major crop, and in Andhra Pradesh state, over 1 million farmers grow peanuts. Now, the main use of peanut in India was to crush it into edible oil. But then about 7 years ago, we opened up our imports, and Malaysia produces palm oil at roughly half the price. And so even with some tariffs, there was the landed price of palm oil was much lower than, say, domestic peanut oil price. And the net result of that is that these million farmers, for whom the main crop, and indeed the only agronomical choice in that climatic zone is this crop, basically just fell off the market. And they don't really have an alternate livelihood. But do I still support import of edible oils from Malaysia? Yes, I do, because it benefits 300 million consumers. They are all getting edible oil at half the price than if we produced it domestically. So what is my answer to this dilemma? What I'm saying is that part of the tariff that we impose on imported edible oil should be converted into an adjustment fund, which should be not part of the consolidated budget of India and get lost in all kinds of things, including subsidizing bureaucrats' salaries. It should be directed towards specific targeting adjustment of livelihoods of those million farmers whose livelihoods got threatened due to this. So while I think I stand very much, and a number of people in India stand very much for the final benefits of globalization and liberalization, the path on the way is difficult, and we need to recognize that there are a number of constituencies which are getting hurt in the process. I'm not talking about the vested interests. I think if they get hurt, no problems. I'm talking of poorer people, the silent majority, and we need specific mechanisms by which they can be helped to transition from. In the peanut example, for example, we can convert the use of peanut from edible oil to protein. So to switch that, you need to make investments in changing the genetic stock, the kind of seed that's used, the agronomic practices, remove aflatoxin, have, instead of oil crushing units, you need to have peanut butter factories, and a whole lot of other things. All that requires investments. It requires investments in public goods as well as in private factories and so on. And that needs to be helped along in the process, even if that means a non-liberalized intervention. I'd like to just make one more point, sure, which is that in the U.S. context, when this is before the U.S. became independent, there was the slogan, "No taxation without representation." And I feel that it's time for us in developing countries to say, no globalization without universalization. And let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, in some ways, what Juan talked about, which is fair and inclusive development. If we have, on the one hand, for example, say India's financial sector has opened up considerably, and since I work in that sector, I know the numbers. In 1993, 18% of the total bank loan by outstanding amount used to go to what are called small borrowers. 10 years after liberalization, that percentage has come down to 5.3%. And it's not because the total size has gone up, it has partly because of that, but in terms of number of small borrowers, it's come down from 57 million to 36 million. So the problem is that liberalization of the financial sector in India has effectively ensured that the financial sector is turning its back to the poor. And I'm not talking about just the poor who need doles. I'm talking about economically active small farmers and micro-entrepreneurs. And unless we find a way to ensure reasonably universal access of services like health, education, transportation, electric utilities, and definitely financial services, to talk about globalization is a kind of a travesty, and it will create too many internal strains. And therefore, we need, after 10 years of liberalization, some rest and focus on the internal disparities within India. And I agree with Peter Sutherland that a lot of that agenda has to be addressed by us internally. It has nothing to do with WTO. The gaps of income, per capita income, between the poorest Indian states and the well-off Indian states are already 1:6. WTO is not going to sort that out for us. And we need to, therefore, establish mechanisms where globalization proceeds simultaneously with enhancing access, which is what I call universalization. Thank you very much. I'll come back with some other points.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to later I will come back and ask you how does it work that the liberalization of the financial sector has as a consequence the shrinking of credit for the people that need it the most, Tell us about the mechanics of that. Why don't we do it now, by the way?
Okay. Well, it happens in two ways. To begin with, India went through the reverse cycle about 30 years. In 1969 to 71, the banking system was nationalized, and it was given a mandate to expand into rural India and lend to small farmers. And then in 1980, there was a further mandate to lend to below poverty households. So the entire banking system was basically a command and control structure, and it used to respond to government directives. 1993 onwards, when the banking system was asked to change its focus and focus on prudential norms and on profitability, even though it still continues to be state-owned, they completely switched. Now they had a good excuse not to do what they didn't want to do anyway in the first place. And so as a result...
Can I just make one comment?
Yes.
Because in the United States, in the 19th century, there were very strong restrictions on interstate banking. Banks could only operate in one state. The reason for that was they wanted to make sure the credit went to the rural farmers and that all the credit wasn't sucked into the New York and the other money centers. So this is a pattern that we've seen historically. So in that sense, it's not a surprise. The second point is that, again, in the United States, there was a recognition that mortgages weren't going to average Americans, and the Federal National Mortgage Association was set up with an explicit mandate to get mortgage money available for lower and middle income individuals particularly. It got established, and after it worked for several decades, it was then privatized. But the point was there was a very strong role in government. There was a free market didn't produce these very important social results.
Joe, that's precisely my point, that by the time liberalization gets transferred to, say, India in the financial sector, people forget that the US banking system was largely structured around small community banks, that S&L, still President Reagan fixed them, were an important source of credit to small families, and that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were major government interventions to ensure housing loans. And indeed, the SBA, the Small Business Administration, is another major source of subsidy of some sort to the small sector. So all of this gets forgotten when good practices get translated into Basel I and now Basel II. So our banks get to adopt just the neoclassical ethos without forgetting that the rest of it, which was there and which was very suited to the US polity and which ensured that there was reasonable equity within the United States, that is not there. So we don't have the equivalent of Community Reinvestment Act in India. We don't have Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, nothing. And what I'm saying is that we need both. We need our banking system to be prudential, but we also need it to be held accountable for providing financial services to a vast majority of India's population. Today, less than 1/3 of India's active economic producers have even a bank loan account. And there's no way we're going to, enhance that inclusion by globalizing India's financial sector.
Thank you. That's, I think it's a fascinating, very interesting example. Taizo Nishimuro is the chairman of the board of Toshiba Corporation, as you know, everywhere. A very successful global corporation with a global reach. He's also a member of the Commission on the social dimensions of globalization that associated with the ILO. But I wanted to ask him about one new facet that is rapidly accelerating of the globalization, and is this trend towards outsourcing and offshoring production. And more companies are able to just relocate economic activities, manufacturing and others, to low-income countries. Talking to Joe and Juan the other day, the question was, is offshoring and outsourcing a way both to efficiency? There's no doubt it reduces costs, but there is also a way of compressing global salaries. And is offshoring and outsourcing a way of making the world more efficient, or is it a way of making the world more unequal? Or both?
Well, a very difficult question you raised, and before going into that specific question about outsourcing and offshore production, I would rather like to come back to this commissioner's position of social dimension of globalization of ILO. Myself and François Perrigot from France were the only person representing a business experience. And we have encountered a tremendous prejudice about this multinational enterprise. Multinational enterprise is deemed almost like a monster, doing evils worldwide, utilizing globalization. But we really feel that it is not true. Without having these multinational enterprises, that all those activities internationally done creates value, added value that the international enterprise created have contributed for the betterment of the life of the world. And that is a very important point, and we tried hard to convey that message, although Joe did not agree too well about this. His famous book was also translated into Japanese and well accepted. But going to now this specific question of outsourcing and also offshore, I think it is it really is a necessity of the activities of the multinational companies. At this point, the outsourcing of the software goes to India because there's a great accumulation of the knowledge and talent of the people. And to utilize the ability of those people is the best use of the human ability. And we have to take advantage of this type of contribution that can be done. And I think that outsourcing and offshoring is a normal economic activities from the viewpoint of the multinational companies. And from our view, that international trade is very important, and anything which prohibits the international trade is a hindrance of the growth of the worldwide economy. And I think that the growth of the worldwide economy has some negative factors, it is true. But at the same time, there are great contribution to the betterment of the society. In case of Singapore agenda that you mentioned a little bit, we still do feel that all those items are very important for the future of globalization, especially that trade issue, which has been raised as the most critical and issue which was not accepted by the developing countries. From the viewpoint of the multinationals, the companies which are large enough do not need any trade accord. We can negotiate with the government, but the trade accord is necessary for those small and medium enterprises who wishes to go out. And they have a small stake to be exposed. And for the purpose of those small and medium enterprises, it is very essential to have some sort of international coordination and agreement to support their interest. So far.
Thank you, Taizo. Do you think you were able to change the perceptions, the negative perceptions against the multinationals in the Commission, or after you?
I think in February that Commission report comes out. It is well-balanced accomplishment of the members or commissioners. So I do believe that to some extent the misunderstanding about the multinationals has been resolved.
Thank you. Well, much food for thought and very provocative ideas. So let me open it up to all of you. And yes, please tell us who you are when.
You did a great job as a moderator, by the way. I read this sort of counterintuitive op-ed piece about trade, and I wanted to ask Mr. Mahajan and Mr. Sutherland. It said that, sort of contrary to what we all imagine, that if agricultural subsidies in Europe and the US are reduced, and the markets open to products from developing countries, agricultural products, in fact, it would be disastrous for the small farmers in developing countries, because enormous multinational corporations would come in, do large-scale intensive farming, and maybe wipe out some of the small farms. And I was just wondering what you both think of that idea. And if it's true, what would be the solution?
Thank you very much. Peter.
Well, I suppose the simple answer to that is that the current situation is untenable because it leads to dumping of agricultural products in one way or another on markets which are consequently in their productive capacity damaged or ultimately destroyed. And the opportunity to export and the avoidance of cheap imports and creating a market system is something which is very important. And I think in the end of the day, of course, part of the consequence of liberalization is that it imposes new possibilities for efficiency in the development of products that are saleable elsewhere through the most efficient methods, which can sometimes mean and lead to the sort of issue that you're talking about. So there's no simple answer to your question. There's an element of merit in it. I still think that the acceleration of the process of liberalization, and let's live in the real world, there are millions of subsistence farmers in Europe, and it's not just Europe and the United States, it's also Japan, Korea, it's India in regard to protection of its agriculture, it's Norway, it's Switzerland, and many of them are worse than some of the big offenders that are pointed at. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue which is a gradual issue, and my complaint is that the gradualism has been too slowly, it has been too gradual, and it should move with greater impetus, and part of the obligation of the developed world is to do that. I'd just like to make two balancing points, and this isn't by any means an exoneration of the developed world. But when you take the United States and the political realities, you have to also recognize the enormous trade deficit that the United States currently has. And one must also recognize that in looking at international trade at the panacea for all economic problems, and this is a point that has already been made, the reality is, in my opinion, to use a rather inelegant word, lousy government in many of the developing countries is by far the biggest problem. Cronyism, protectionism, and so on and so forth. And some of the holier-than-thou arguments, particularly from trade unionists in some parts of the developed world, are essentially protectionist. And the argument about outsourcing, if you go to Bangalore and you say advance the arguments that are being advanced in some parts of the developed world by some members of the trade union movement whose fundamental rationale should be to support equality of opportunity, I think the people in Bangalore would give short shift to the argument that American or European firms should not be allowed to outsource. I thought that the principle of competitive advantage still had some reality and also had some bearing on equality.
Thank you, Peter. Vijay Mahajan.
I think, first of all, multinationals coming into India and taking over large tracts of land and doing very efficient farming is a very unlikely scenario given the land relations in India. However, it does not mean that opening up of agriculture is an unmitigated blessing for Indian farmers. Particularly, we must remember that about 3/4 of our farmers are not net producers of surplus. They are subsistence farmers. And indeed, even for food crops, cereals, they are not producing enough even for the household. And therefore, in the conceivable scenario that through international opening, the domestic prices go up because of exports, you may actually end up hurting a large number of people who are either landless, marginal farmers, or small farmers. So it's a complicated scenario, and I agree with Peter that we need, first of all, an overarching agreement in agriculture that international trade should be significantly opened up, particularly by the developed countries. But thereafter, I think there are commodity by commodity issues. And the example that I gave earlier about edible oil imports into India, it's a classic example, from Malaysia to India, or indeed Argentina to India, where India is not, so far at least, competitive. So in the long run, in 30 to 40 years' time, or maybe 20 if we accelerate our scientific research and extension, we may be globally competitive in a number of crops. But today, I don't think that is true, and there is a whole history, thanks to the Green Revolution period, of highly subsidized inputs, seeds, fertilizers, water, irrigation, electricity, and indeed procurement prices. And this has benefited the middle and upper tier of farmers. So trade would also mainly benefit those people. But would they want international trade as well as domestic subsidies? I think that's a contradiction that we have to fix. And that's, again, as I said, it's an internal agenda that we have to first address, rather than so much a global trade agenda.
Thank you, Vijay. Juan Somavia wants also to say something on the subject.
Yes, just one comment, Peter. I think that no country has a monopoly on good governance, whether it's governments or private enterprises. This is a generalized problem, as Accountability International has shown. I would like to just make one comment. I think that by now we understand that liberalization across the board in all countries at whatever cost is not something that is viable. So it's selective, you have to be careful about it, you have to sequence it, etc. But it has to go with another major concept which has not been there from the beginning, and which the fact that so many people are finally affected by it, whether they were affected before, because not all of the ills of poverty come from globalization, but many of the ills have not been solved either. So we need to have some basic socioeconomic floor. So we can be pushing opening, as a global rule, but we also have to say, well, every society needs a social floor. Vijay was mentioning that we can't open up without ensuring that some sort of adjustment is there. Well, the social dimension of liberalization was totally lost. And I think that the time has come to put it in place. But this means that it becomes part of the official international policies. And it hasn't been. On the contrary, the policies of the 80s and good part of the 90s, it has begun to change, was to tell governments, look, forget about social expenditure. This is not very effective expenditure. Just concentrate on, on the monetary and fiscal budget deficits, etc., those sort of things, which of course had to be done. So I would suggest that towards the future, we have a selective process of liberalization according to the real possibilities of the countries and the institutional setup, but we have to agree that as part of a global economy, there is an economic and social floor, and that we have to, and that countries have to be helped internationally to be able to fund that floor. And that's a totally new approach. That's not something that we have on the cards today, but unless we put the floor, the other part is not going to function because people are going to feel that they're not receiving the benefits. I think that it's perfectly feasible, by the way. This is not a dream. This is practical, it's possible, but it's a question of deciding politically that we need to do it. And I think that this will bring a lot of stability for, again, I come back to the Davos constituency, for large corporations, because what large corporations need is a stable societies. The more societies are stable, the more unsure the investments are. So this is, I think, a general need for the people living in those situations, but also for the stability of the global economy.
I think Peter's body language once...
Well, I think that nobody can deny or disagree with the moral underpinning to what has just been said. Safety nets in all societies are necessary and desirable. I think, frankly, that the evidence suggests that the possibility of a substantial fund being provided over and above current resources made available to the World Bank or to any other international institutions to provide that safety net in countries other than the countries that are the donors themselves is something that we were very unlikely to see. Since the Brandt report, we've been at a reduction from the 0.7 of 1% of GDP rather than an increase in the amount of giving of this kind. And I just don't think it's going to happen at an international level. Unfortunately, it may be wrong, but it's going to be domestic level that it will be done by. And nor do I think that in the end of the day, I think that the social responsibility of multinationals is something which is much more evident than it was in the past. But in the end of the day, multinationals are in business to create efficiently products, and they're not going to be a panacea for the sort of issues that you're talking about. They are going to hopefully make a contribution to efficiency in developing things. I actually hate the word multinational because it's used in some countries and contexts almost as a pejorative term, and it's complete rubbish. It means any company that's operating across borders, so there are hundreds of thousands of them all over the world, from developing and developed and everything else, so you can't generalize about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me take the question of the gentleman here and then. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. I'm Pedro Couto from the Ministry of Planning and Finance of Mozambique. Really, I'm following with the interest the debate. But I think that we are failing to look to the issue, recognizing that indeed there are many differences coexisting with the idea of globalization. We have the developed world, but within the developing world, we have differences also. I think that the situation of China, Brazil, or India is quite different. Is compared to what would happen in sub-Saharan Africa. It's really very different. Mr. Sutherland has said that, well, probably, and he's right, that in sub-Saharan Africa, we have very different needs that goes to mainly to infrastructure, including human infrastructure. It seems to be quite serious, this issue. Now, what it's my worry is that, well, it doesn't seem that there is consistency in recognizing this. Generally, when we talk about this, we start to think that, well, there in sub-Saharan Africa, we just need some measures for poverty alleviation in general with some safety nets. I don't think it's that. Really, what we need is some consistent policies for serious and deep social and economic transformation in order to have in place the needed infrastructure that will allow these regions to be really integrated in the world market. This is the big part. Of course, there are some measures for poverty alleviation, but at the same time, something has to happen in terms of putting there in place the economic infrastructure that is needed for any time to have these regions really included and participating normally in world trade.
Thank you.
Now, my question is why this is not being easily recognized and accepted, and what are the possibilities for us to have the needed flows of resources to have this happening? Because just domestically, we cannot handle it because of the levels of poverty we have.
Why don't we let
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we let Joe Stiglitz take that question?
First, I think the point you raised about the large differences across countries and across regions is important. We were talking about the net benefit of the Uruguay round. For instance, the studies at the World Bank show that sub-Saharan Africa was unambiguously worse off because of terms of trade effect from the Uruguay round. It wasn't just that they got a smaller share of the gains that the United States and Europe benefited disproportionately, but sub-Saharan Africa was actually worse off. And that's a reflection that you have to be sensitive to how different countries are going to be affected, and different people within the countries, which has been emphasized a number of times. We've already talked about the problems of assistance, and I have the same little pessimism that Peter has, that there is, I mean, one of the interesting things about in the United States where some polling has been done, which is most Americans think that we should give a significant amount of aid. They think we ought to be reducing the amount of aid than the amount that we give, but their view is that we are already giving a huge amount. So there's a real misunderstanding. Most of them actually have a sense of generosity, but they think we are being excessively generous, when in fact the data is that we're giving about 0.14% of our GDP. So there is I think that there is some scope here for trying to make people understand how bad the situation is. The third point I want to make relates to something that you raised earlier, which is the integration of the different international institutions and the coordination of the different institutions. Assistance is important, but one of the problems, I think, is the overall macroeconomic framework, which is often imposed on developing countries, and it relates to the point that Juan made about employment. The standard theory of why trade is good trade liberalization is good is that you redeploy resources from protected, low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors where exports. Now, if you're in an economy that has a 25% unemployment rate, you don't have to release resources to redeploy them. They're sitting there unemployed. When you liberalize, you put more people into the unemployment pool, and then if your financial markets aren't working, you can't create the new businesses for the exports that are high productivity to move them out. If you combine that with an imposed macroeconomic framework, say coming from the IMF, that says high interest rates, excessive fiscal austerity, then you're creating more unemployment and making the cost of capital higher and credit less available. And there's a sense in which trade liberalization, I think, in many countries is failing because of the macroeconomic framework that does not allow for the job creation and the new enterprises creation. The success of China is testimony that when you simultaneously are creating new enterprises and new jobs with entering into the globalized market, doing it at your own pace, basically, then it could be enormous benefit. And globalization can work for promoting economic growth. But unfortunately, the way it's happened in Latin America and in many other countries, it has been a disaster.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Eigen, Chairman of Transparency International. I would like to address the dilemma which Mr. Nishimuro has stated of multinational corporations or transnational corporations, that they are painted into the corner of the devil in a way by civil society, by many of the critical actors in globalization. I would say most participants in this discussion understand very well the tremendous opportunities which transnational corporations offer to the world. And they understand very well how much they contribute and how much more they could contribute to the well-being of the world. The problem is that it is very hard to harness these assets in a way that they really serve the people in a sustainable way. 30, 40 years ago, the attempt was made mainly by insisting on competition, by having strong antitrust and competitive requirements. But it very soon became clear that this is not a worldwide way of regulating business. Only a few countries have antitrust laws, for instance, and the leading countries allow their companies to collude and divide markets and cooperate outside the borders as long as their own economy is not negatively affected. So this was more or less given up and ended up in the creation of the Center for Transnational Corporations in order to strengthen at least the negotiation position of the developing countries, in particular in extractive industries, where they seem to have some leverage over northern multinational corporations. But this became inconvenient, and after about 10, 15 years of existence of the center, it was at the insistence, I would say, of big business. It was dispersed and in its impact destroyed. Now we have basically the anti-globalization front, which tries to mobilize itself in order to find another way. And this other way seems to be to create a global governance which is symmetrical with the power, with the global reach of transnational corporations.
Peter, give us the question. I have several hands.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
And the question I would like to ask is, do you also see this dilemma? Are you supporting these various efforts to create a global governance which can give this social impetus which has been postulated by civil society? For instance, are you participating in the Global Compact? Are you trying to give teeth to the Global Compact?
And your question is for Taizo Nishimuro.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me, well, thank you very much for your understanding, and also that the multinationals feel their responsibility as a social dimension. And Global Compact, which was proposed by Secretary General Annan of the United Nations, we are one of the companies adopted Global Compact. And that is one of the ways for the expression of the declaration, so to speak, or the social responsibility of each individual companies. And that is very important to reassure that our good intention is for the goodness of the people in the world. Thank you.
I have several hands up, 10 minutes to go, and I want to give a chance to all of the panelists to have another round. Why don't we take several questions and then please direct them specifically to whomever you want. So let's start here and then we'll go to the other hands that are raised. Please.
My name is Richard Werner. I'm an economist. The historical record shows that successfully developed economies developed due to trade policy, including tariffs and other trade intervention, industrial policy, government intervention, including the direction of credit, as has been mentioned. Now, this is how they developed. This includes, of course, the UK and the US as well, and Europe and Asia. And so they benefited as a result from increased international trade and what in the past was not called globalization, but what basically was the same thing. Now, globalization and increased trade takes place, but it seems that the international organizations make it very difficult, if not impossible, for developing countries that would like to do the same thing to take advantage of the benefits from increased trade. Because it's, well, basically, they're prevented from engaging in the same type of trade policy, tariffs, infant industry protection, direction of credit. The international organizations very strongly discourage that or outright forbid it and punish countries that do that. So my question is, perhaps as a representative of one of the leading international, former representative of leading international organizations, to Peter, do you see that perhaps with increased awareness of this, there is a chance that the Washington Consensus will change and that developing countries will be allowed to have these policies, including trade barriers, in order to build up high value added industries and then have better terms of trade and gain from trade more?
It's a question based on highly controversial assumptions. Let's hold it there, and the gentleman in the back.
Yes, Suman Berry from India. I want to thank the panel for a very rich discussion. One question on agriculture and one on financial systems, primarily, I guess, for Peter Sutherland and Joe Stiglitz. On agriculture, two things seen from the perspective of a large populous country like India. One is that we have an interest in cheap food. So, I mean, if indeed the world is willing to give us food cheaply, we should be accepting it. The real issue is adjustment policies in agriculture. Is there any creative thinking about what might constitute positive adjustment policies in large agrarian societies? Secondly, on the financial system, you know, I think Vijay gave part of the reason why we went for liberalization, but really the point is that a lot of the interventions that Vijay and Joe are pro were leading to distorted crony capitalism. Now, was that part of the US experience, and if not, why not?
Thank you very much. The gentleman here, please.
My name is Kitashiro Keizai, Chairman Keizai Doyukai Japan, and Professor Stiglitz mentioned about global warming. And if the major countries like the United States and China do not join the Kyoto Protocol, then that will give unfair competitive advantage for some of the corporations operating in these countries. So what's your prospect of US joining Kyoto Protocol, and what are the international community can do to encourage the US to join? And to Mr. Nishimuro, what the reaction of the multinationals if some of the countries do not join the Kyoto Protocol? Are you going to take advantage of that environment to take advantage of your operation? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Two.
I have a specific question. I would like to
tell us who you are, please.
I'm Hugo Gonada from a national newspaper from Argentina, and I'd like to go forward with specific proposals from all of you. So I'll use the country I know most, Argentina. That this country committed several mistakes, but now it's trying to revive until its unemployment rate is high, the international credits on agricultural markets are closed, but the international demands goes on. How do you manage globalization in such a specific case?
Thank you very much. Last question.
Yes, I'm Giorgio Sandi from Spain. My question is for Juan Somavia. You expressed some concern at the beginning about the jobs and that there are a lot of people that need some jobs. I wanted to know if outsourcing and offshoring could be help this process, and if could help also that the globalization would be more fair. Basically, I wanted to know your position on that point. Thanks.
A wonderful set of questions touching on a variety of fascinating issues. Why don't I give you a few minutes to all of you? Why don't we just start in the way you're seated, perhaps beginning with Joe Stiglitz.
Okay.
I do have to ask all of you to be brief because we will need to close this in about 8 minutes or so.
As an Irishman, I find that rather difficult to handle.
First, on the question about the utilization of industrial policies, trade policies, a whole set of policies that were used in the 19th century and even in the 20th century by a number of countries in their growth strategy. I think, and they were used by the East Asia countries as part of their East Asia miracle. I think that some of the things that have gone on, the WTO, the Washington Consensus, the international financial institutions, have really limited the ability to use those, and I think that's a mistake. The model that has underlay a lot of the discussion in economic model in recent years has been this perfect information, perfect markets model that basically economic theory, modern economics, has really thrown serious questions about, and that there are roles for these kinds of interventions. I think the question about the fact that there have the question is the political aspects of this. Does it lead to crony capitalism? Is a serious question. And I think one of the interesting questions that, for instance, the World Bank dealt with in the East Asia miracle was exactly that. And one of the answers is there are rule-based ways of having these subsidies that are less subject to cronyism, less subject to corruption. And there are, no system is perfect, but actually they've worked fairly well. That actually relates to just a remark I wanted to make in response to one of the earlier questions. In multinational responsibility, we now know a lot about the things that went wrong. One of the things that helps things is more transparency, and there is a greater support now for understanding of transparency. I think one of the interesting things is that some of the multinational corporations have been supportive of this. BP tried to have transparency in what they call the publish what you pay in Angola. And the interesting thing is the other oil companies would not go along. And I think this is the kind of thing that ought to be a part of the WTO, where you say we require good behavior of the companies, and the good companies will actually welcome this, and it will force the other companies to go along. The final question, two questions on the environmental issue. I think a very big distinction between the arena of global public goods and local public goods, global environmental issues and local environmental issues. Global warming is a global environmental issue, and clearly, in my judgment, ought to be within the purview of the international community. There is a framework within the shrimp turtle case for other countries to bring a case against the United States for its subsidies, effective subsidies through greenhouse gases and low energy prices, and I think somebody ought to do that. Final thing on Argentina, my view on that is at least one aspect. One aspect of globalization we haven't talked about are the real problems in instability of the global financial markets. And there's been very little done about that. Some of the things that were done in the 90s made it worse. There are things that ought to be done to make it better, like a reform in the global reserve system and better mechanisms for transferring and absorbing risk.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Yes,
Taizo.
Three things I would like to now point out. One is I didn't have a chance to talk about that agriculture issue. Japan has a very peculiar position about agriculture. Japan being the largest importer of agricultural product by far. That's one. And also at the same time, Japan do not have any substantial export of agricultural product. And we have small amount of farmers who needs the change to adopt this. And also another difficulty of Japan is at this point our self-sufficiency is only 40%. 60% are supported by the import of the food. And Japan has a very peculiar position about this. And the second point I would like to mention was in response to Mr. Kitashiro's question, that whether the multinationals like us are trying to take advantage of this, the Kyoto Accord in adherence of those major countries. To tell you the truth, that we have very stringent code internally as far as establishment of production facilities outside of Japan. That is in accordance with the most stringent code issued by the countries and including Japan. In other words, we have no intention to take advantage of this difference of the government's policy as to the conservation of the energy or the global warming. The second point. And third point is we have admiring the rapid growth of China. And one of the difference in between the growth of Japan and growth of China is China's acceptance of foreign direct investment. Huge amount of foreign direct investment that were flowing into China. That is the engine for their growth, whereas Japan's growth was sustained by the Japanese capital principally. That was a major difference. There are two ways for the growth. And easier way is to accept the foreign direct investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Well, I would start with the proposition that nobody believes that untrammeled capitalism, a ruleless global society in terms of the market economy, is desirable. So that's not an issue. Prudential controls, competition laws, and so on and so forth are necessary everywhere. And everybody accepts that. But there is a balance between those who are in favor of moving towards more openings of markets and those who have a basic disposition towards a slower progress. Now, I believe that in answer to the question as to whether industrial policy and gradualism should be increased, I would say that the answer to that unambiguously is no. We have seen the economies which have benefited least in terms of growth during the course of the last decades, almost invariably coming from the camp of protectionism, often masquerading under alleged social concerns, and in reality denying their own citizens the opportunity of participating in what I think is an immensely positive development in global interdependence. And I think it's opportunity that is being provided. Now, of course, Joe is right. There are problems, and there are cases that haven't worked correctly. But can you extrapolate from the oligarchs in Russia to general systemic problems in globalization? Can you talk about the differences in approach in the Asian financial crisis in one place to another as being indicative of generalities? I think you can sometimes draw lessons and you sometimes can't. But the overall trust of what is happening is undoubtedly good, and it's evidenced by massive increases in foreign direct investment, particularly into developing countries. Not all of them, but some of them, and in general into the countries that are opening up most rather than those that are opening up least. And I think that that is an extremely good thing, particularly in the context of the limited expectations that we can have of major transfers of money in the context of the 0.7 of 1% of GDP area and so on, much though that may be desirable and necessary, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that the reality is that developing countries are gaining from it, not as much as they possibly should. We probably should be moving faster in various areas of liberalization in Europe and the United States. But as I say, we have to recognize in trade negotiations that whilst people must push for movement, there are political difficulties. And at the moment, the surpluses and deficits in global trade are an issue which worry me, because I think we have to get momentum going again in the Doha round, and we have to do it realistically. But we also have to do it with a sense of concern about equity. And one final point about cooperation. Cooperation between the international organizations is undoubtedly something that has to be enhanced. I'm chairman of the advisory board of the WTO, and that's one of the issues that we're looking at. But the reality is that there are also areas where there are clear differences of opinion. For an example, in regard to labor rights, where the member states of the WTO are very anxious to keep the issue out of multilateral negotiation rather than bring it in, whereas there are other constituencies that have a very different view. And when one uses cooperation in terms of discussions of this kind, it can lead into issues of principle of that kind, which are very intractable and difficult. I know that may not be what the specific issue that Juan was talking about, but it is one of the things. But undoubtedly, the organizations have to work more together. The WTO is outside the UN, whereas all of the other institutions are within it. That's, in my opinion, as it should be and should remain, but it shouldn't in any way inhibit greater dialogue and communication between the WTO and the UN agencies, including the specialized agencies.
Thank you, Peter. Vijay.
Moses, I'd like to confine my comments to a single point, which is the need to expand the financial sector significantly, and particularly to address the predicament of people in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the point raised by the gentleman there. I think the development of the financial sector and its financial deepening in general is a key to development happening in developing countries. And unfortunately, the financial sector is governed by financial sector professionals, and they in turn are further governed by their international peers, who are largely concerned about the stability of the international financial sector, things like capital adequacy norms, all the stuff that comes out of Basel I and Basel II now, is in fact very, very deleterious to the expansion of the financial sector in developing countries. Just for an example, before liberalization, India had 200 banks with capital of less than $500,000. Now, you can't set up a bank in India unless you have $30 million of startup capital. Now, this level of capital adequacy has been imposed in some ways by the international financial sector professionals who don't feel accountable for a more fundamental point, which is universalizing access to financial services, which is very, very important. So I think in some ways, the point that Juan made about this kind of cooperation across organizations, I think the cooperation has to go beyond just at the level of rhetoric. It's got to be brought into the technical committees, into the working groups, and I think we need to be made aware that each of the subsectors has a responsibility to a wider goal, which is development. We had President Wolfenson here just 2 days ago lamenting the fact that the total resources of the World Bank are completely inadequate for say, the developmental tasks that it is supposed to address. How about, for example, considering a percentage of the tariff collections that happen all around the world and putting that into development? Even if 1% of the total tariffs that were collected went into a developmental fund, whether administered by WTO or the World Bank, would create a very substantial pool for development in countries like Africa. But ultimately, just to close my point, the money will be of no use unless there is an efficient but pro-poor, pro-development financial sector in the developing countries. And till then, just giving us more and more money will not work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay. Juan.
Yes, let me take up the question on outsourcing and delocalization offshore. I think that in a global economy, those movements are going to happen. And you have objective different cost structures in different countries. I think that from my point of view, the important thing is that this should not be done on the basis of not respecting workers' rights everywhere. There are fundamental core labor standards that whether you are Lesotho, or Chile, or Sweden, like freedom of association, collective bargaining, no child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination, these are things that are valid universally. And that's what you have to be careful about. Now, the problem has been that developing countries received the policy advice that if they wanted to get investments and export, they should set up export processing zones. And in which, if you gave some concessions on the labor side, that wouldn't be bad. That would probably stimulate. And that's where the thing becomes complicated. And that's why from the ILO point of view, we've said we believe that the ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Works of Rights, which doesn't have to do with cost levels, it has to do with enabling rights of workers, has to be respected everywhere, which, by the way, is the position of the business community and workers. So the question is a question of implementation, and there's a lot of non-implementation going on. Let me make one final comment, which is the following. The reason some of us are concentrating on the social dimension of all of this is that we're looking at what has happened in practice. Let me just give you some figures about Latin America. From 1980 to 2003, rural unemployment has gone up by 50%. The growth of the informal economy has gone up by 50%. The social security coverage has gone down by 30%. And the purchasing power of the minimum wage has gone down, as the medium in the region has gone down 25%, and in some countries 50%. Now, this is a pretty big period of observation. So when people look at these figures, they say, look, we need to see how is it that we deal with them. And this is the basic point. These are not ideological preferences that you think that this is better than the other. These are real problems in our societies that are in fact political problems today. And that I think that we need to deal with them, and we have to look at them face to face. Whether we like it or not, these things are happening. At the same time, a lot of people have benefited. So my point is, unless we have dialogue, unless we are open-minded to listening to others and say, well, they're not inventing things here, they're trying to make a point. And we find a way of dialogue, of putting all the stakeholders around the table and say, look, it is true that there are too many people unemployed, and it is true that there's a big, decent work deficit in the world. So what do we do about it? But what do we do, not with a theoretical answer, but with, what is it that business can contribute? What is it that civil society can contribute? What do the international organizations have to do? What are the larger governments that are the larger economies, developed and developing? I am perfectly convinced that putting around the table the actors that can take decisions on these questions will give us positive answers. And I believe that that's the road ahead.
Thank you, Juan. The fact that we are way over the time allocated to this session saves me from having to summarize the discussion that has been wonderful and essentially shows how important, controversial, difficult, and still very confusing this subject is. But I think you would all agree with me that Taizo, Nishimuro, Juan Somavia, Joe Stiglitz, Peter Sutherland, and Vijay Mahajan have given us very, very much good food for thought and a very useful perspective that will clarify our thinking. So please join me in thanking them for a wonderful session.